Good morning. I am Father Bill Daly, the St. Thomas More Fellow of the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this session on continuity and development, Newman on Doctrine. The greatest day, or one of the greatest days of my priesthood was when Father Jenkins, the former president of Notre Dame, asked me if I would consider taking up then Archbishop of Dublin, Diarmuid Martin's invitation to create some project for Notre Dame at a beautiful church on St. Stephen's Green that John Henry Newman built. And I'm pleased that I said yes, because that led to one of the most memorable days of my priesthood, which was in 2019 when I was able to be in St. Peter's Square for the canonization of John Henry Newman. So I'm pleased to be here this morning on a day of great cultural exchange between South Bend, Indiana, and the city of Pittsburgh. We have sent 100 football players and a third of our student body for a big cultural event in Pittsburgh, and we have taken 3 of Pittsburgh's finest to come here and talk about John Henry Newman. But enough about me and about football. Let's get to our speakers' bios. Our order might be different from what you may see in your programs. We're going to begin with Kenneth Parker, the Ryan Endowed Chair for Newman Studies and Professor of Historical Theology in the Department of Catholic Studies and Theology at Duquesne University, a trustee of the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, and senior editor of the Newman Studies Journal. In 2024, along with Dr. Christopher Cimarelli and Dr. Elizabeth Huddleston, 2 co-panelists, he assisted the Dicastery for Causes in its consideration of St. John Henry Newman as a doctor of the Church, which of course was proclaimed with great joy for all of us on All Saints' Day. Next, we will hear from Elizabeth Huddleston, Head of Research and Publications at the National Institute for Newman Studies, also teaches in the Department of Catholic Studies at Duquesne University. She is an editor of the Newman Studies Journal and the Newman Review, an online journal of the National Institute for Newman Studies, and serves as editor for the NSJ Second Series. Third, we will hear from Ryan Bud Marr of the Mercy College of Health Sciences. He is Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences in Des Moines, author of Seeking God with St. John Henry Newman, and To Be Perfect is to Have Changed Often. I knew that by quote before I could see the words. And he has also contributed essays to Newman and Life in the Spirit, Learning from All the Faithful, and the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman. Before coming to Mercy College, Dr. Marr served for 3 years as the director of the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, during which time he was associate editor of the Newman Studies Journal. And last, and certainly not least, Christopher Cimarelli of the National Institute for Newman Studies. There's a takeover here. He is director of the National Institute for Newman Studies, editor of the Newman Studies Journal, a teaching fellow in the Department of Catholic Studies at Duquesne University, and honorary fellow in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University in the UK. A graduate of Villanova and KU Leuven, which I gather is, like its cognates, the Catholic University of Leuven, where he did his doctorate in theology in 2015. Cimarelli has published numerous articles and book chapters and is author of the academic monograph John Henry Newman's Theology of History, as well as contributing co-editor to several academic volumes, Scholar Sage Saint, The Legacy of John Henry Newman, One Bread, One Body, One Church, and Salvation in the World, The Crossroads of Public Theology. We welcome all of our speakers, and we begin with Kenneth Parker.
I want to add the point here at the beginning that this paper was a collaboration between myself and Michael Shea. It's a presentation that we made jointly at the symposium just prior to Newman's conferral of the title of Doctor of the Church. Among the many themes for which St. John Henry Newman is known, his understanding of development of doctrine is one of the most important. Though development of doctrine is not original to Newman, one could make an argument that glimpses of this concept can be found in the Old Testament and Jesus' teachings, as well as the writings of ancient and medieval theologians. He crystallized the idea of development that was already well advanced in 19th century theological debates, particularly in Germany. Though he had rejected the concept outright in the 1830s as an Anglican leader of the Oxford movement, in the early 1840s, he found in it a path toward his decision to become a Roman Catholic. He was received into the Roman Catholic Church less than a month before the publication of his famous study on the subject. This brief presentation will consider the contours of St. Newman's understanding of development, and will look, again, very briefly, at the reception of Newman's theory of development of doctrine by popes since 1845. My hope is that this will open the subject for the uninitiated, and for the well-informed will set the stage for questions you might like to pose. Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, published in 1845, stands at the crossroads of theology, history, and religious psychology during a time of transition both for Newman's life and the life of the Catholic Church. The essay on development wrestled with a crucial question. If Christian revelation was complete in the apostolic age, how can the later, more elaborate dogmas of the Church, such as the Trinity or the Marian doctrines, still claim continuity with the original faith? Newman's answer hinged on the distinction between revelation itself and our understanding of that revelation. Faith for him is a living response to divine truth once given, while doctrine is the conceptual articulation of that truth through time. Faith is constant in its object, God's self-revelation, self-disclosure in Christ. But human reflection upon that disclosure must grow, adapt, and clarify as the Church encounters new contexts and questions. Thus, development is not a corruption of faith, but its natural unfolding within history. To explain this, Newman introduced his 7 tests, which he later referred to as notes of authentic development. He explained that true developments are long-lasting, preserve the original type, maintain continuity of principle, and exhibit a logical sequence and assimilative power. False developments, by contrast, distort or contradict the seed from which they grow. Newman used the metaphor of an idea as a living organism. Just as an acorn becomes an oak without ceasing to be itself, so too Christian doctrine matures without losing its original essence. This organic image captured both continuity and change, 2 dimensions that Newman refused to oppose. Newman's historical sensibility also shapes his understanding of faith. He saw the Church not as a museum of frozen propositions, but as a living body animated by the Spirit. The same divine life that inspired the apostles continued to guide the Church's reasoning through councils, controversies, and the witness of saints. Development, therefore, is an act of faith in divine providence. The believer trusts that God not only reveals truth once, but also preserves and deepens understanding within the community of believers in human time and experience. Most importantly, Newman insisted that this growth was not arbitrary innovation. Development occurs under the authority of tradition and ecclesial discernment. Doctrines are tested in controversy. Error and heresy, paradoxically, help the Church to define truth more precisely. In that sense, history becomes a theological laboratory in which the meaning of revelation is purified and sharpened. The essay on development thus reconciles 2 impulses often in tension within Christianity: the desire for fidelity to apostolic origins and the necessity of intellectual progress. Newman acknowledged that external forms, such as language, philosophy, and liturgy, inevitably change, yet he maintained that the inner substance of faith endures. His theory allowed him to see the Roman Catholic Church not as an accretion of superstitions, but as the mature expression of principles already latent in primitive Christianity. For Newman, therefore, Faith and development are not opposing forces, but complementary dimensions of life in the body of Christ, the church. Faith anchors the believer in the unchanging mystery of Christ. Development articulates the mystery anew in each age. To deny development is to deny the living historical reality of revelation. To embrace it without discernment is to risk distortion. The task of theology, Newman reminded us, is to walk faithfully between those extremes. It is to trust that divine truth, like a living tree, will grow and unfold toward the fullness of light. Given this brief overview of Newman's theory of development, we must now turn to the reception in the life of the church. While volumes have been written on this subject, for our purposes here, I will briefly give highlights of reception by popes in their pre-pontifical and pontifical pronouncements. 8 months before Newman's beatification in 2010, His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, in an address to the bishops of England and Wales, observed, quote, "The characteristics of the great doctor of the church, it seems to me, is that he teaches not only through his thought and speech, but also by his life, because within him, thought and life are interpenetrated and defined. If this is so, then Newman belongs to the great teachers of the church, because he both touches our hearts and enlightens our thinking," end quote. This observation was made in the context of the Pope's reflections on Newman's understanding of development of doctrine. He stated, quote, "Faith is always development, and precisely in this manner, it is the maturation of the soul to truth, to God, who is more intimate to us than we are to ourselves." In the idea of development, Newman had written his own experience of a never-finished conversion and interpreted for us not only the way of Christian doctrine, but that of the Christian life, end quote. Newman embodied in his life and thought what his teaching has helped us understand about the church as the living body of Christ in our world. Pope Pius IX declared in Singulare Quidem in 1856, under the teaching influence of John Henry Newman, quote, "We should not conclude that religion does not progress in the Church of Christ. There is great progress, but it is truly the progress of faith, which is not change. The intelligence, wisdom, and knowledge of everybody has to grow and progress, like that of the whole Church of the ages. In this way, we might understand more clearly what we used to believe obscurely. In this way, posterity might have the joy of understanding what used to be revered without understanding." In the late 1960s, Joseph Ratzinger embraced the need for a historicized understanding of tradition and looked to St. John Henry Newman's teaching for insight into development of doctrine. He observed in his 1969 commentary on Dei Verbum, quote, "Vincent of Lorraine's static semper no longer seems the right way to express this problem." In 1986, in an article on the ecclesiology of Vatican II, Prefect Ratzinger praised John Henry Newman's concept of development, describing it as one of the decisive and fundamental concepts of Catholicism, and noted that Vatican II, quote, "had the merit of having formulated it for the first time in a solemn magisterial document." In his first Christmas address in 2005, Pope Benedict XVI firmly placed development at the heart of Catholicism's understanding of tradition. In his 2010 dialogue with Rabbi Abraham Skorka, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, like Benedict XVI, affirmed Newman's teaching on development. He stated, quote, "Religious truth does not change, but it does develop and grow. It is like the human being. We are the same as baby and in old age, but in the middle, there is a whole journey." End quote. So, it has been the firm magisterial endorsement of Newman's teaching on development from Pope Pius IX to Pope Benedict XVI to Pope Francis that provides the ultimate justification, in my view, for Pope Leo's recent affirmation of St. John Henry Newman as a doctor of the Church. For Newman's life and thought interpenetrate and illustrate the power of his teaching on development as the way we come to know truth in the living body of Christ, the Church. Thank you.
So I'll be speaking today on Newman and modernism, how a theory helped shape the church. Despite being a pivotal time in Catholic history, the Roman Catholic modernist crisis is typically not understood outside a small group of academics who have devoted much study to it. The modernist crisis is often dated from the promulgation of Providentissimus Deus in 1893 to the death of Pope Pius X at the beginning of the Great War, both of which occurred in 1914. What is missed when we overlook this short period is how Newman's theory of doctrinal development influenced the Catholic intellectual landscape in the generation following his death. This transitional moment in the Church's history triggered conversations about the nature of divine revelation and our role in interpreting and disseminating it, many of which are still with us today. This presentation provides a brief introduction into how the often contentious discussions concerning doctrinal development would help shape the Church in the first half of the 20th century. While volumes could and have been written on the topic, I focus here today on a rather small episode of contentious grievances that English theologian Wilfred Ward hurled at biologist St. George Mivart concerning how to interpret Newman's theory of doctrinal development. My reason for using Wilfred Ward to introduce this topic of the modernist scholarship, even though he was not necessarily a central figure to the controversy, as was the likes of Tyrrell or Loisy, for example, is because he was particularly interested in how Newman was being interpreted and used by theologians, some of whom stretched Newman's theory grossly past its theological limits. It is also true that Ward's reception of Newman would come closer to what would eventually be solidified as doctrine in Dei Verbum. Demonstrated here is that the centralmost points of contention for the voices within the modernist controversy was a fundamental dissonance in their assumptions about the nature of Christian revelation and how divine revelation is passed through the generations. For example, is God's revelation sets of propositions that are being passed to the faithful through the succession of bishops? Does this revelation, or at least our understanding of this revelation, develop and grow in the course of human history under the guidance of the Holy Spirit? Should we hold a chiastic view of history in which time corrupts our understanding of revelation and only a return to classical or the original sources can mend? Or should our contemporary scientific and historical methodology act as a corrective for the theological and philosophical mistakes of the past? Newman's theory of doctrinal development was central to how all of these questions were addressed during the modernist controversy. What follows here, though, is an explanation of how Wilfred Ward interpreted Newman's theory within the context of his dispute of St. George Mivart in the 1890s and the first few years of the turn of the 20th century. So we're not quite at the height of the modernist crisis in 1907 with the promulgation of Pascendi. This point in Ward's theological career is important because it acts as a baseline for how he would continue to defend Newman against what he perceived as threats from the later interpretations of Newman from Henri Bremond and George Tyrrell around the time of Pascendi's promulgation in 1907. Arguments with Mivart. Ward's interpretation of Newman's theory of doctrinal development centered on the language of an unchanging deposit of faith, what he called the semper idem. In this schema, it was the explication of the deposit of faith that develops rather than the deposit itself. Regarding the nature of doctrinal development, Ward was concerned that George Mivert argued to have found changes within the deposit of faith itself rather than in the explication. As the title of his essay, Unchanging Dogma and Changeful Man, suggests, he argued that, quote, a revelation of changeless truth has been made to restless, changeful man, whose media of apprehension and modes of expression were ever altering, end quote. Ward evoked Newman's famous phrase, quote, to live is to change and to be perfect is to have changed often, end quote, as an example of his understanding of the explication of the church's undeveloping deposit of faith. Ward's proposition was that the revelation of dogma is that which does not change and is considered objective and immutable. It is at the level of reception and passing down that our understanding of revelation is considered subjective or immutable, and which can grow in time. In distinguishing between that which is semper idem and the explication thereof, Ward was required to, quote, look for the operation of this undying principle in our own age, as well as in its predecessors, end quote. Where Mivert went wrong, according to Ward, was that he's supposed to have found a new discovery in the meaning of dogma itself rather than a new way of expressing this immutable dogma. Ward argued that change cannot occur in the dogmas themselves, but only in our understanding and explanations of them. In other words, humans can grow in knowledge, understanding, and expression of the dogma, but the dogma itself cannot actually change. Likewise, Ward distinguished dogma itself from dogmatic propositions. He defined dogma in its theological sense as, quote, a truth contained in the Word of God, written or unwritten, i.e. in scripture or tradition, and proposed by the church for the belief of the faithful, end quote. And he provided the example of the incarnation to demonstrate the distinction between dogmas and dogmatic propositions. Ward explained that the dogmas are typically broad statements which cannot be disputed and which are followed by propositions that help to explain and define what the essential dogma means. Moreover, how we interpret the dogma depends on the scientific and historical context throughout history. Ward would later explain this process in 3 stages. The first being truth as it is in itself and is known as known to God, and this is in your handout. The second stage is truth as it was revealed per modum unis in the apostolic church, such as an impression or idea of divine truth as it is possible to man to have. A symbolic picture of reality. This idea or picture given to the apostles in direct revelation was handed on by them to their successors. And the third stage, the gradually more exact comprehension in the Christian mind of the outcome of this picture, and the consequent filling up by theology and express dogmatic definition of details implied but not expressed in earlier statements of revelation. As one may complete in an oil portrait a face. And this is word I venture on the genius and character of which are given unmistakably in a charcoal sketch. The idea conveyed by the original outline sketch does not change, but the sketch is complete by filling in what it from the first implied. And that's Wilfred Ward's words. The query that Ward had for Mivert was whether or not, quote, the traditionary explanation of a dogma is identical with the dogma, or is it only the ways of stating the Catholic proposition natural at one stage of scientific knowledge, impossible at a later stage, end quote. It is with this question that Ward accused Mivert of error. Mivert, according to Ward, regarded dogmatic propositions as exhaustive expressions of reality, and consequently the changes in their explication were to him not the attainment of greater precision in the development of dogmatic expression, but the gradual succession of dissolving views exhibited at the bidding of the man of science on the canvas of theology. Mivert's confusion, according to Ward, was that he did not properly understand the depth of mystery in Christian dogma. Propositions, even dogmatic ones, are never meant to be exhaustive. If one understands dogmatic propositions as such, as in the case of Mivert, he, quote, ignores the fact that dogmatic mysteries confessedly exceed all human language and conceptions, end quote. Ward explained that objective reality exceeds human intellectual capacity, and therefore it is impossible to know exactly how much correspondence the dogmatic proposition has with the objective dogma. It is in the midst of this mystery that development of the explication takes place. As Ward stated, quote, the element of mystery taken as including all the unknown particular determinations of a general dogmatic proposition is responsible for nearly all changes and developments in the explication of dogma, end quote. In short, Ward understood two facts about the doctrinal development. The first, dogmatic propositions, even when they are all forms, are only analogies to the reality and not to be equated with it. And two, the formulation of our understanding of individual dogmas was gradual, and the explication of later ages was not known to the earlier ones. I will conclude by saying that just 2 weeks ago, all of us on this panel witnessed Pope Leo XIV declare St. John Henry Newman the 38th Doctor of the Universal Church. From our vantage point today, it is hard to believe that 100 some odd years ago, clerics and academics alike feared that Newman had been condemned a modernist in the wake of the promulgation of Pascendi Dominicis Gregis in 1907. Wilfred Ward, for example, wrote to the Duke of Norfolk, I don't believe the Pope meant to condemn Newman, but he has done so beyond all doubt so far as the words of the encyclical go, not only on development, but on so much else. Here's the nemesis Newman foresaw, arising from popes trying to give the church intellectual instructions by encyclicals, which has never been done before Pius IX's time. It is a piece of modernism. Continuing, Pascendi's theology is drawn up not by a keen mind alive to the religious controversies of the age or even to the established facts of history, but by a scholastic theologian who may either be anti-Newmanist, as they often are, or does not know Newman's work and condemns the modernists on certain points in terms which, beyond question, equally condemn Newman's theories. The situation is, I cannot but think, most serious, end quote. Ward was not the only one to think that Newman had been condemned. George Tyrrell also questioned whether Newman had been condemned, which is evidenced in his article titled, The Pope and Modernists, Is Newman's Teaching Condemned? End quote, which was published in the Manchester Guardian on the 20th of November in 1907. The fear of Newman's condemnation was widespread enough in the British Isles that Bishop Edward Thomas O'Dwyer from the Diocese of Limerick, Ireland, published a 45-page essay arguing for Newman's orthodoxy. The consensus among Vatican officials, however, was that Newman was not condemned as a modernist. Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, for example, always championed Newman's orthodoxy, as is evidenced in his article for the Osservatore Romano, in which he underlined the, quote, world of difference between what the cardinal taught and the modernism which is condemned in the encyclical, end quote. Likewise, Pope Pius X responded to the Bishop of Limerick with a letter which he proclaimed from St. Peter's in Rome, the same place that Newman was declared a doctor of the church, in which he declared unabashedly that the modernist, and I dare say all of us here today could, quote, learn many excellent things from such a great teacher, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm sure some in the room have had the experience of writing a title for a paper at a conference and then writing the paper and realizing the title doesn't quite fit. So I think mine says reclaiming the idea of doctrinal development. It might more appropriately be phrased applying Newman's theory. And this is sort of a problematic that I've been trying to untangle in my own mind, so I hope there's time for some question and answer and I would love to hear what others think. So the idea of doctrinal development came into its own at the Second Vatican Council. Catholic theologians had been writing on this topic since at least the time of Vincent of Lorraine, and St. John Henry Newman provided the definitive synthesis of the concept in the 19th century. But it is at Vatican II that the hierarchy gave official approval to the theory. Now, the narrative around acceptance of doctrinal development has undergone critical evaluation in recent years. The standard historical account had been that Newman's theory quickly came under suspicion and effectively went underground until the Nouvelle theologians picked up the thread in the decades just prior to the council. My former colleague, C. Michael Shea, has published a compelling revisionist history in which he demonstrates that the early reception of Newman's idea was largely positive. Newman worked with the highly respected Roman theologian, Giovanni Perrone, to qualm concerns about his theory, and the idea itself played a crucial role in both the 1845 dogmatic declaration of the Immaculate Conception, as well as debates at Vatican I. Nevertheless, it is fair to say that some level of skepticism continued to surround Newman's theory, especially during the early 20th century, when high-ranking church authorities such as Pius X were seeking to combat modernism in the church, as Elizabeth so helpfully outlined for us. In this sense, the idea of development did emerge from a kind of shadow at the Second Vatican Council. Particularly significant was the following affirmation from Dei Verbum number 8. The tradition which comes from the apostles develops in the church with the help of the Holy Spirit, for there is growth in the understanding of the realities and the words which have been handed down. Thus, the church constantly moves forward towards the fullness of divine truth until the words of God reach their complete fulfillment in her. Since the time of that statement, Catholic theologians have taken for granted the reality of doctrinal development. That is to say, all theologians worth their salt, whether conservative or progressive, start with a baseline assumption that Christian doctrine has developed since the time of the apostles. What's more contentious, however, is precisely how that takes place. Newman signaled his own caution on this topic when he revised the language of his essay to refer to notes of development as opposed to test of development, as he had put in the first edition of his work. Experience has made it clear that Newman's notes cannot be applied in a simplistic, formulaic manner while debate on a given question is underway. They are more helpful as tools for testing developments retrospectively after the church has articulated some clear guidance on a particular topic. This dynamic is challenging, and maybe I'm speaking mostly for myself, because what many of us want is clarity on controverted issues. So consider, for instance, some of the most hotly debated topics of our time, say the admission of women to holy orders, the precise nature of marriage, and the moral admissibility of capital punishment. On these matters and more, theologians and sometimes bishops appeal to the idea of development, though sharp disagreement persists on how to adjudicate divergent applications of the concept. This difficulty is evident in a letter issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith regarding a revision of the Catechism's treatment of the death penalty. The letter states that Pope Francis asked that the teaching on the death penalty be reformulated so as to better reflect the development of doctrine on this point that has taken place in recent times. That's straight from the letter. This development, the letter continues, is driven principally by a clearer awareness on the part of the church for the respect due to every human life. Following the lead of St. John Paul II, the authors primarily focus on the protection of members of society. The document states, if in fact the political and social situation of the past made the death penalty an acceptable means for the protection of the common good, today the increasing understanding that the dignity of a person is not lost, even after committing the most heinous crimes, and the development of more efficacious detention systems that guarantee the due protection of citizens have given rise to a new awareness that recognizes the inadmissibility of the death penalty and therefore calling for its abolition. The conclusion of the letter actually references Vincent of Loren's Commonitorium in defense of this revision, stating that the change situates itself in continuity with the preceding magisterium while bringing forth a coherent development of doctrine. In that same section, it returns to the idea that modern society possesses more efficient detention systems and that a convicted murderer can serve a life sentence without posing a serious threat to the well-being of others. On a certain level, I understand that's fine. The hierarchy has legitimate reasons to be concerned with the unjust manner in which the death penalty is applied in modern societies, particularly here in the United States, to the point that Catholics should work for its abolition. My concern, however, is with how tradition has been handled when the magisterium has addressed this specific question. Prior to the latter part of the 20th century, when Catholic theologians or popes addressed the morality of capital punishment, they did not concern themselves primarily with the prudential question of how society is best able to protect itself. Rather, their concern centrally had to do with the question of justice. Even as recently as 1952, Pope Pius XII made clear that the Church did not regard the execution of criminals as a violation by the state of the universal right to life. So I don't have to read the whole quote, but Pius XII said, "When it's questioned the execution of a condemned person, the state does not dispose of the individual's right to life. In this case, it is reserved to the public power to deprive the condemned person of the enjoyment of life in expiation of his crime, when by his crime he has already disposed himself of this right to live." So I think that phrase, in expiation of his crime, is something that is not, addressed in detail by more recent statements. So my contention this morning is this: as church leaders go about addressing debated theological questions, they should proceed cautiously in their handling of the tradition. John Henry Newman's essay on development is the classical treatment on this topic, and his approach in the essay was a fundamentally conservative one. So Dr. Parker already outlined some of this, but the first note of authentic development is preservation of type, meaning that a validly developing doctrine will never become something essentially different. Newman also highlights the importance of logical sequence, i.e. later developments should be the logical outcomes of the original teaching, similar to how an acorn sequentially develops into an oak tree. And finally, the church acts with conservative action upon its past. So an authentic development will clarify and strengthen prior doctrinal statements rather than contradicting them. When it comes to the development of doctrine then, Newman had in view the church coming to a deeper understanding of what it had taught across time. He was not advocating, it seems to me, for a reversal of prior teachings. Now, that might sound obvious to some in the room, maybe more contentious to others. If you're in that latter group, you are not without company in the wider guild. Whereas Newman emphasized preservation of type and logical sequence of ideas, in recent decades, certain theologians and historians have argued that to fully appreciate the significance of some doctrinal developments, we have to be able to let go of our attachment to continuity. With respect to the Second Vatican Council, for example, some of the most important developments were quite simply discontinuous with the Catholic past, and that's okay, or so this argument goes. This line of thinking has sparked vigorous debate within the church about the proper handling of tradition, and the highest level critique came arguably from Pope Benedict XVI, who in a 2005 Christmas address to the Roman Curia critiqued what he called the hermeneutic of discontinuity as applied to the council. What's fascinating is in that talk as an alternative, Benedict did not suggest a hermeneutic of continuity as one might expect. Instead, he argued that the proper way of understanding the council was through the lens of a hermeneutic of reform, of renewal, and the continuity of the one subject church which the Lord has given to us. According to Benedict, the council had to determine in a new way the relationship between the church and the modern era. So he outlined three issues: the relationship between faith and modern science, the relationship between the church and the state, and the problem of religious tolerance. And Benedict says in that address that in all three cases, it was only natural that some kind of discontinuity would emerge. But he says, after various distinctions between concrete historical situations and their requirements have been made, this is the key phrase, the continuity of principles proved not to have been abandoned. As Benedict saw things, it is only the principles that express the permanent aspect since they remain as an undercurrent, motivating decisions from within. On the other hand, not so permanent are the practical forms that depend on the historical situation and therefore are subject to change. So using the example of religious freedom, he says if it's presented as an expression of the human inability to discover truth and thus becomes a canonization of relativism, then this social and historical necessity is raised inappropriately to the metaphysical level and thus stripped of its true meaning. That idea of religious freedom cannot be accepted by Catholics, but Benedict continues, it's quite different, on the other hand, to perceive religious freedom as a need that derives from human coexistence, or indeed as an intrinsic consequence of the truth that cannot be externally imposed upon others. In defending this other idea of religious freedom, the Council Fathers were recovering the deepest patrimony of the Church, an idea that can be traced all the way back to the teachings of our Lord, and which have been embodied in history by the martyrs, who by their sacrifice showed that no state or governing authority can coerce a profession of faith without thereby undermining the very integrity of belief. I find Benedict's explanation of how doctrinal development works compelling, while at the same time I acknowledge that certain theological and moral issues present greater degrees of complexity than does the question of religious freedom. I have to say forcefully this morning, so as not to leave the wrong impression, I have zero interest in defending capital punishment as a live political option. You know, the way it's practiced in our country is deeply problematic, so I would never vote to support it. What I am pressing here, rather, is that theologians and bishops do more to explain the precise reasons behind particular developments, so as to assist the faithful in their understanding of the why behind such changes. On the surface, Pope Francis' condemnation of the death penalty appears at odds with earlier papal statements, such as the quote I gave above from Pius XII. Perhaps more should be done then to show how the Church got from point A to point B. Moreover, we have to remain open to the possibility that later developments have limitations of their own and may require further development in order to demonstrate the underlying continuity with previous magisterial teaching. To refuse to undertake this work could erode the faithful's trust in the integrity of the magisterium, and if something different than development is going on, then church authorities should be willing to say so. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. It's been such an extraordinary time in Newman studies with the recent conferral of the title Doctor of the Universal Church on St. John Henry Newman by Pope Leo XIV. For those of us contributing to Newman's cause over the last few years, it is the confirmation of something we know deep in our hearts, namely that Newman's teaching and doctrine are of enduring value for the life of the Church. Now, I'd be lying if I said I would have put my money on Newman being declared the co-patron of education along with St. Thomas Aquinas. I would have bet on development or modernity. However, this is quite the auspicious surprise, given that my talk today is on the handing on of living tradition through catechesis and religious education, and how Newman's thought can facilitate and bolster those efforts. My presentation is structured in 3 sections and aims to provide just an overview given the limits of time and the goal of this session to produce conversation. Section 1 outlines recent pedagogical studies about increasing student engagement in cognate disciplines. Research indicates that students participate to a much greater extent when content is perceived as relatable or relevant to their lives and experiences, which often feature uncertainty, difficulty, and tension. Section 2 analyzes Newman's view of conflict in the life of the Church and how its treatment advances his larger goals in writing, namely supporting believers in their living commitment to faith despite significant obstacles for example, those stemming from historical consciousness. Newman's projects on doctrinal development and real assent, I think they're quite closely connected. Section 3 reflects on how Newman's view of conflict might serve to enrich catechesis and education broadly conceived, and in consideration of Pope Leo XIV's recent letter on education. What I'm presenting on here today is in fact part of a larger book project on conflict and catechesis. In this slide, beyond offering some information about the notion of catechesis, I mention my background and interest in the subject, as well as theology and religious education in general. And even though I'm a cradle Catholic, I went through OCIA in my 20s after studying theology at the graduate level. And then I was involved in OCIA for about 10 years. And my wife was a religious educator, and our children go to Catholic school, so it's something we're deeply interested in. I have been especially motivated by studies on varying levels of student engagement in the natural sciences, as well as history. In these, I have discerned clues for possibly bolstering catechetical and educational goals, so that the gospel might, as the slide suggests, continually resound in one's heart, or at the very least, learners might perceive and experience connections to the content being engaged. I believe that there is significant risk in focusing primarily on the results of past controversies. So one study by Lynn Siegler and others looked at different methods of teaching Einstein and how students tuned out or tuned in depending on the approach of the educators. And on the slide, as you can see, there are a couple of major takeaways from this study. In the first place, students' beliefs that success in science depends on exceptional talent negatively impact their motivation to learn. Exposure to scientists' achievement stories alone does not foster connection and even leads to poorer results for certain segments of students. So there was a testing of a novel story-based instructional approach that models how scientists achieve through failures and struggles, and in a couple of ways, in their personal lives, experiencing struggle, but also on the process to realizing their major achievements. And from this model, there were promising results for student achievement and experience of connection with the course content. And the use of struggle stories provides a promising and implementable instructional approach that can improve student motivation and academic performance in science and perhaps other subjects. It's one of the takeaways of the study. And then a few more studies I looked at as well, dealing more with religious education, catechesis, and confirmation. So these noted the pitfalls of approaches featuring idolization or demonization in terms of the content, as well as certain themes that were important for learning faith across age groups in catechesis, including providing spaces for questioning, and even experiences that are both considered hands-on, but also experiences that provide students with leadership opportunities where they're actually challenged to engage the content and assemble the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. And by doing that, students, even though they feel inadequate to the task, are actually end up buying in and engaging the content much more. And that's what the first bullet point highlights as well, that some of these historical studies noted that pedagogy was promoted by stoking curiosity through introducing manageable, engaging confusion from primary and secondary material, as well as giving students the chance to do history, and again, assemble the pieces. So in a U.S. history course, that might be assembling the pieces of the Declaration with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, so on and so forth. So in the light of these studies, I have been reflecting on how they might inform catechetical approaches and might problematize tendencies to focus on memorizing the doctrinal results of the past, looking to minimize any confusion or questioning on the part of the student or catechumen. Of course, attempting to implement the takeaways of these studies without sufficient discernment and training would be a precarious endeavor. Believers must learn the creed, but much more is needed to support faith while investigating how the language of the creed emerged in history. So let's now go to Newman and conflict. In some ways, it is fair to say that Newman's entire theological project engaged conflict in the life of the church, precisely to bolster faith. Regarding his first major work, The Arians of the 4th Century, in 1833, Rowan Williams has observed that in it, Newman gives a real theological valuation to the processes of intellectual history and does not attempt to deny that the accurate perception of Christian truth is shaped by conflict. In fact, Newman's early research had uncovered a problem about orthodoxy in the early church and how its explication required time and controversy. Over the course of the next decade, he struggled to conceive the continuity of the church throughout time and how revelation might be safeguarded throughout history and beyond the time of the primitive church. The result, which also led him to Catholicism, was his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. Regarding this work, Cardinal Ratzinger stated in 1990, "With this, he had placed the key in our hand to build historical thought into theology, or much more, he taught us to think historically in theology and so to recognize the identity of faith in all developments." In other words, Newman had turned a weakness into a strength. And his essay emphasized that when engaging the church's past, a theological and historical account were both valid. For example, regarding Chalcedon in 451, Newman argues that one can maintain theologically that the definition is the apostolic truth once delivered to the saints, so the theological account. But, and I quote at length, "The historical account of the council is this, that a formula which the creed did not contain, which the fathers did not unanimously witness, and which some eminent saints had almost in set terms opposed, which the whole East refused as a symbol not once, but twice, was forced upon the council, not indeed as being such an addition, yet on the other hand not for subscription merely, but for acceptance as a definition of faith under the sanction of an anathema, forced on the council by the resolution of the Pope of the day, acting through his legates and supported by the civil power." End quote. This is a candid assessment of the Chalcedonian result defining the Christology of the church. But it's especially important to highlight that Newman affirms both the theological and historical accounts, and he allows them to exist in a productive tension. Newman's work treating the 4th century, for example, in the Arians of the 4th century and on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, likewise did not shy away from conflict and disagreement in the church, and particularly in episodes that yielded the Nicene Creed. These works, in fact, highlight the complementarity of the different parts of Christ's body, the church, or what he ends up calling instruments of tradition, especially the laity and the sensus fidelium at a time in the 4th century when certain leaders had strayed from the faith in a period of intense conflict. Later in his career and following the First Vatican Council's definition of papal infallibility, Newman sought to account more precisely for, quote, "the dark side of the church," which he believed was anticipated in God's providential ordering and economy of salvation. In Newman's correspondence and writings post-1870, he likewise avoided repressing uncomfortable historical facts and episodes, and even contributed a major ecclesiological reflection with his preface to the Via Media, Volume 1 in 1877. Bud's done a lot of work on this as well. This text outlines how the offices of the church function, the offices of priest, prophet, and king, roughly equivalent to worship, teaching, and hierarchical rule. Newman argues that while these offices are administered perfectly in Christ, there will never invariably be tension in their administration in the life and time of the church, and thus this ought not be shrugged off as merely the consequence of individual sin. Through his work, Newman was hoping to prepare the whole church for the challenges it would face from the modern world, and he was especially invested in the preparation of the laity. He knew that many obstacles for belief existed. If one could not appreciate God's ordering of the church, so that it could develop as needed to safeguard the faith, as well as its necessary struggle, both internal and external, to perform Christ's work, then one was quite vulnerable to the loss of belief. In his masterful treatment of religious epistemology and imagination, an essay in aid of a grammar of assent, Newman describes the importance of real assent following the apprehension or discernment of true objects and realities of belief. Not mere notions that touch the intellect, but realities that inhabit our minds and indirectly prompt us to act. His overall project assists believers so that their experience of the church, through imperfection, tension, and conflict, is authentic and real, and that the Lord has not forsaken them. In fact, when you understand how God works in and through the church, the light of the Lord shines all the brighter. In this concluding third section, we reflect on how Newman's theology, as treated in section 2, responds constructively to the insights gleaned from section 1. As such, Newman can be an excellent guide for religious education, formation, and catechesis, and thus for the handing on of tradition. In order to focus and really to limit myself, I suggest we turn to Pope Leo's recent letter on education from just a few weeks ago, drawing new maps of hope and Newman's new designation as co-patron of education. At the conclusion of his short document, Pope Leo affirms that while our educational history is rich, it needs updating so that, quote, tradition and the future can intertwine without contradiction. Catholic education can be a beacon, not a nostalgic refuge, but a laboratory of discernment, end quote. This education is to support the formation of the whole person, the head, the heart, and the hands. And institutions of education must speak to the heart. Leo also highlights the dynamism of history and how tradition is living, open to the other seen as an asset, not a threat. In fact, he highlights how an open vision and encounter with the other yields the development and deepening of our own self-understanding and teaching. These insights accord exceedingly well with Newman's theology of tradition and Vatican II documents like Dei Verbum and Nostra Aetate. On conflict itself, Leo remarks that education can serve to rebuild trust in this world riven with conflicts and fears, but he also notes that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the gentle strength that rejects violence and certain destructive approaches to the other. Newman is invoked a few times in Leo's letter, and my sense is that Newman's theology is even more pertinent to its contents than many realize. The call for a renewed education that transforms teachers and students certainly accords well with Newman's educational writings and biography. But his theology of tradition and how it involves squarely facing conflict and tension within and outside the church is potentially of great benefit for enriching Catholic education today. If Pope Leo calls for laboratories of discernment and the updating of pedagogy, then Newman's theology of conflict should inform any such efforts. Keeping in mind the fruits of Section 1, educators might reflect on how curricula might introduce manageable levels of confusion designed to excite curiosity about the very beliefs being proclaimed every Sunday. They might also provide students with leadership opportunities so that groups might together assemble the structural elements of the deposit of faith. And dioceses and orders might also take time to reflect on what it means to prepare educators themselves to introduce and navigate conflict without overwhelming students. Such caution is warranted even in considering the provision of spaces for questioning, which depends on things like class size and session length. The ultimate goal being that students, in their minds, hearts, and imaginations, might realize that their own struggles join them directly to the ongoing struggle for the faith, and that their very participation will secure it for those who follow. Thank
you. If Newman hadn't already been canonized, this would have provided a second miracle. All four speakers came in under their allotted 15 minutes. This has never been known to happen. I have, I suppose, just one question. It's kind of a meta question, and it may, in a sense, contradict itself, and then we'll open it up to the floor. In a lot of contemporary debates, including over the death penalty, just a couple of months ago, I think it was, Edward Feser wrote an article rather strongly invoking Newman with his disagreement, it appears, Feser's disagreement at least, with the development of doctrine on the question of the death penalty. People on the left and the right love to invoke Newman as Newman was a liberal in today's cheap sense of the term, or Newman was a conservative in today's cheap sense of the term. I guess my sense, and here's the self-contradictory part, is the only thing I would think Newman would want to be invoked for is, here's how I'm thinking about this problem in honor of Newman. And that Newman would be better honored if somebody who agrees with the developments we've seen in the teaching on capital punishment and somebody who disagrees could say, here's what I'm taking from Newman as his student, and here's what I have to say. He's not here to say whether I'm right or not, and it doesn't really add to the argument, and I've never seen anything in Newman in which you would think it would add to the argument to say, and by the way, Newman would agree with me if he were here today. But it happens a lot, so I don't know. You all have spent a lot of time talking about Newman, thinking about Newman. None of you have been guilty of this parlor trick today, but do you have any thoughts on it?
Right, I think that's helpful. Newman certainly never shied away from controversy, I think, as Chris's paper helpfully laid out. I hope I don't mischaracterize what you said in Rome, but you mentioned something to the effect that he probably didn't intend the theory as sort of a tool that you could use in time, sort of like you plug in papal statements and
retrospective.
Yeah, so it's used to look at developments retrospectively. What I was wrestling with in my paper is maybe it's a lack of subtlety on my part. I understand what Benedict was saying about religious liberty and how that whole conversation has taken place. I think with something like capital punishment, or maybe church statements regarding slavery, the tension seems stronger. And I wonder if there are occasions in church history where the logic that's taking place is something more like ressourcement, like we're recovering an earlier important idea that has been sort of, I don't know, lost or like obscured by later statements. It's not so much development in the way that Newman talked about it. So there's maybe a different kind of logic that can help to explain, especially certain developments that have taken place, like in moral theology.
Yeah, I'd like to just to add to that. Bud's a former student of mine, and he's a jewel of humanity. So I want to start by saying that. But I also count among my students, former students, men who have committed murder and violent crimes. As I founded a prison education program at St. Louis University. That personal experience, invoking Newman's life experience as a factor in understanding development, certainly forced me to think more profoundly about the question of capital punishment. You know, one of my students was on death row for 10 years, and his case ended the juvenile death penalty here in the United States. I think the efforts to make an argument from development have not been cogent and persuasive. I've argued in the St. Louis University Public Policy Review that Christianity is founded and has as its central symbol the case of a man unjustly arrested, whose case was manipulated, who died an unjust death, and was resurrected. And if that's not an acorn growing into an oak, I don't know what is. It seems to me that we can make the argument at the very heart of the Christian message. We have a case for ending the death penalty. It may have taken us 2,000 years to make that argument in magisterial teaching, but it's been made. And I think Newman's theory offers us an opportunity to invoke that.
Yeah, and real quick, I had this caveat in the paper, but the point of my paper was certainly not to support the death penalty. It's looking at but yeah, that's very, very well stated.
We have a question. Father Anthony.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. I'd like to continue a little bit on this vein of the question that Father William just brought up. I don't know if part of the problem is that, one, we're sort of trying to use development to explain a lot of things that maybe you should try to explain in different ways. Two, it's maybe conflating, let's say, if we talk about development and the theory of development, Newman is your only resource. And then maybe this might be a tough sell for a panel of Newman experts, but wouldn't it be helpful to discussions on development to recognize that in 19th and 20th century there have been several different theories of development? I think in my doctoral research, I came across an article from the year 1911 from the Dominican in the Revue des Sciences Philosophiques et Théologiques that talks about the question of tradition, and in a footnote, like as if it was something normal, he says, yeah, there are several development theories, some are unacceptable for Catholics, and then he cites Harnack, Loisy, and Sabatier, and says several are acceptable, and cites Müller, Newman, Roman School, Blondel, and I think a few others. So would it be helpful to the discussion on development to say, look, Newman has one theory of development, and that a theory is not the reality, and maybe we need also to see what theory of development you are working on in order to answer these questions. Thank you.
Yes, and I think that's what the church has done since Ressourcement and the Second Vatican Council, right? So Dei Verbum, for instance, it talks about development, but it doesn't cite Newman. It doesn't say Newman's theory of development is doctrinal, right? So Newman himself, as a thinker now, is a doctor of the church. So we can hold his theory as important for sure, and as maybe a spark that started a lot of conversation that would eventually become doctrinal in the Second Vatican Council and even later. But I mean, you're absolutely right that the modernist crisis, a lot of people, that's exactly what they were talking about, were how exactly can we apply Newman's theory? Can we go past Newman's theory? Can we avoid Newman's theory? And in what ways can we appropriate it, parts of it, but not all of it? You know, I mean, there's lots of different ways, and some were, I mean, it was a tumultuous time in history, so some were condemned for it, and some were not, and some were made doctors, and some were not. You know, I mean, it's just, the way it's worked out has been not linear, right?
Yeah, real quickly, I think you're pressing an important point, and even in Newman's corpus, you could argue there are different theories. So the essay itself, the rhetoric is, I mean, it's kind of unsystematic and difficult to apply. Newman was concerned about how it was being received in the Catholic Church, so he wrote this series of theses with Giovanni Perrone, what's popularly called the Newman Perrone paper, and that's much more sort of like careful and Latin treatment of the topic. It is exciting in recent years to see theologians pick this up again. I think in Newman studies, there's a tendency to treat him sort of with bubble wrap. There's like canonical readings of Newman, but you've seen someone like Matthew Levering, who's here, write an important book on this topic, and then, you know, he and David Bentley Hart went back and forth on sort of like how to best understand and use Newman's theory.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said here. I would also note that even in the essay on development, Newman calls it an hypothesis to account for a difficulty. There's nothing that restricts us from continuing to work on it. He just knew that if he could put this argument out there, it then throws detractors back on their heels, and they've got to come up with a better argument. There's a great book by Mikhail Zavold on the models of doctrinal development in the church, from the early church to the present time. And actually, Ratzinger comes out as one of the most provocative that could really push people, including Newman, in that as well.
This works as a bit of a follow-up question. And I guess I would address Dr. Cimarelli mostly because of your high school experience. I work at the parish level and the high school level. And it occurs to me that when we teach the real presence, we don't have to talk about transubstantiation, but we always do. And so we have a second grade distillation of Aquinas working on Aristotle that we tell to seven-year-olds. And this is helpful in many ways, and it happens all over the church. And this is a critical doctrine. And if you don't have it, you're not really in the Catholic Church in a full way. I would say that not only is the idea of the development of doctrine, especially, but not only, as articulated by Newman, an asset, not a threat, but it is fundamental. And in an age of saturation of information and access by the laity to everything from 19th century encyclicals to papal tweets to dogmatic constitutions, my question is this. Is there a second grade style catechesis version of development of doctrine as articulated by Newman that you've thought about saying, why don't we just say this?
I mean, that's a great question. It's definitely an age group that's a little bit, younger than I normally deal with. But I do think it's a great question. I think, in Newman's apology, he talks about how we can't lie to kids. If we lie to them, they're going to find us out. And it's going to be worse for us in the end. So that is a challenge to us to find a way to work in some of these ideas in an age-appropriate way that hopefully kids can gravitate to. Because now I'd really have to think about that age, because it could be very easy to scandalize at that level. But and even if, I don't know if we want to use the word conflict at that level necessarily, or struggle, but maybe they could appreciate that age, the fact that, I mean, this central teaching is actually quite a scandal in that early time, right? It's like, why is this so strange, right? To say we eat the body and blood of Christ, right? So that's something, I mean, kids have that experience every day of eating. So I would just say, stick close to their experience and try to give them a couple of tools to climb with it. So I can't give you a great answer yet, but I do think it would hold that we can't kind of lie to them at the early stage.
I'd just like to add, I was the director of RCIA in my parish in St. Louis for 15 years. And I taught people like Bud, but I also taught people, I taught children as wide range of experience and knowledge bases. And one of the things that was very clear was catechumens, in my experience, were not afraid of historical complications. In fact, one of the reactions that I got was, oh, there's a history to this doctrine. Wow. It made sense because it was true to their own personal experience. So historicizing is not something that's a danger. I wrote a little book of apologetics called Catholic and Cornered. And one of the tensions that I had with, not with the publisher, but with the Archbishop's office was that there were doctrines that I historicized, presented a history for, and what was insisted upon was this is what was taught in the first century, which was not true. I could name several doctrines, but making the point that historicization of doctrine is not a threat in a world saturated with historical consciousness. Richard? Sure.
Thank you. For Ryan, about capital punishment. It seemed to me that a couple of things had taken place over the centuries to undercut many of the defenses of capital punishment. We have Thomas Aquinas' statement that, well, it's like amputating a diseased organ when it threatens the whole body. In reaction to the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, I think people were very reluctant to use an argument like that as they, the Neo-Thomists, developed in much more full way the idea of the inherent dignity of the individual human being. But between John Paul II and Francis, because John Paul II was saying as long as, whenever possible, use the non-lethal means to protect the innocent. Mm-hmm. So it's protecting the innocent that becomes the defense for, if you can't, if the prison system is breaking down and society is crumbling and killers are out there in the streets trying to kill innocent people, that would be an apparent exception. By saying that capital punishment is unacceptable, Francis seems to be becoming more absolute. Mm-hmm. But I think if somebody had asked him, one of the things I regret about Pope Francis' pontificate is people didn't ask him questions like this, and even when they did, he often didn't answer. But, well, what about that case? And I don't know what he would have said, but he might have said, well, I don't see that as capital punishment. That's more like using lethal force in a just war, right, defending the innocent that are currently under attack. And so the difference between them might be more apparent than real. I just wonder if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think I've wrestled with this question. I even woke up thinking about it. Like when Benedict XVI talked about these permanent principles that are the undercurrent of an issue, I think in this case, the inviolable dignity of the human being and proportionate punishment for crimes are sort of like the permanent principles. I guess what I struggle with what Pope Francis said, so I mean, at one point he says, it's necessary to reaffirm that no matter how serious the crime that has been committed, the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and the dignity of the person. I think that strong of a statement is difficult to square with earlier papal statements. But some of this might be, so Ken was talking about historicizing. There's a whole history to this conversation. And if you extract statements out and just set them next to each other, they look very much in tension and perhaps impossible to reconcile. To actually do the kind of work that I was like pressing theologians and bishops to do requires treating all that history. And so the conclusion of the paper, I don't think I was saying like it cannot be done. I think, kind of like you hinted at, that maybe Francis made strong statements that didn't have enough, you know, like on math exams, like showing your work, maybe like more of that. And that might be sort of a need that I have, but I feel like other faithful kind of feel that sort of pull as well.
We're a little over time, but we started late, so we'll finish with John, and that'll be our last question.
In 2019, the bishops met in Baltimore to discuss, among other things, the proper English translation of Francis's change to the Catechism on capital punishment. And although the moderator said they were not there to discuss what it meant, one bishop got up and said, "What does inadmissible mean?" And the response he got was that it was an eloquent ambiguity, which I find an appalling response. Basically saying, we can tell you what the doctrine says, we just can't tell you what it means. So let me ask you, according to Newman, what it cannot mean is that it is intrinsically evil, because it cannot be doctrinally legitimate yesterday and doctrinally illegitimate today, which is what it would mean if it means it's intrinsically evil. So what does inadmissible mean?
Well, I think your question highlights the challenge that I'm trying to work through. And I do wonder if it's significant that Pope Francis didn't land specifically on the language of intrinsic evil, if that was sort of an intentional decision. But I don't know, does anyone have thoughts on inadmissible? I don't know if I've done enough work to kind of drill down to that.
I'm just a cheap lawyer, but I have exactly that thought. We know that we have the word intrinsically evil in the Catechism and in our tradition, and it wasn't used. So we might think we want to come as far as we can say that within the development of doctrine, we really mean that we've moved past the death penalty in our response to the gospel. But we're not saying we're contradicting earlier teachings. We're not going to use the phrase intrinsically evil. Lots of smart people would have contributed to that decision not to use the phrase. Inadmissible is a strong word. It isn't the same word. So why press and say, don't you really mean intrinsically? Well, if I meant it, I'd have said it. That's, I think, a permissible reading of it. I also thought when you read the letter that Ladaria put out, it includes many other things that show it is, in a sense, contingent within history that we've come to this place. And those are right along that sentence. So that sentence, it seems to me, can be read as complementary of those and not the only thing that's going on here, which again suggests inadmissible doesn't mean intrinsically evil. That sentence does all the work. I would think a future pope, without contradicting that letter, could expand that paragraph a bit to make it a little softer and less ambiguous, that we're not really trying to trick you into thinking this is intrinsically evil. At least it seems to me those are plausible readings as just a lawyer, not a theologian.
It just should never be used in our context. Thank you for jumping in, Father.
Thank you all. And if you want, you can continue over refreshments. I really thank our panelists, and over refreshments, you can continue a lively discussion of whether it's proper to give Plotinus to preschoolers.